My husband had one hand around his mistress's waist when he stood in front of more than 200 reporters, investors, and music executives and announced, "Today, Vale House Music begins a new chapter." A number appeared on the giant screen behind him. $18 million. That was how much North Star Media was preparing to invest through a new catalog-backed financing and global distribution deal. The room broke into applause. His mistress, Sienna, stood beside him in a silver dress. Around her neck was an old guitar pick pendant that had belonged to my father. I stared at it and almost laughed. 3 months earlier, my husband told me that necklace had been lost. Now it was hanging around another woman's neck. And that same woman was about to become a partner in a multi-million-dollar music company using songs my father had written. My husband, Ethan Vale, lifted the microphone again. "There's one more thing I'd like to address. I know there have been some unnecessary rumors about ownership." His eyes moved across the room until they found me. All relevant rights transfer documents were legally executed. Sophie has already left the company. She will not receive any additional benefit from today's transaction. Then he smiled at me. It wasn't a friendly smile. It said exactly what he wanted me to understand. "You lost." I didn't move. I didn't argue because for the past 6 weeks, Ethan believed I knew nothing. He didn't know I already had a copy of the copyright assignment he claimed I had signed. He didn't know my electronic signature had been submitted from a computer inside his recording studio. He definitely didn't know that on the afternoon the document was signed, I had been in Vancouver, more than 2,000 miles away from that computer. And he had no idea North Star's legal and risk teams had already reviewed the device logs. He also didn't know that, minutes before he walked onto that stage, North Star had frozen authorization for the entire $18 million payment. Ethan was about to sign the final documents when North Star's general counsel walked onto the stage. She didn't sit down. She walked directly to the microphone. "Mr. Vale, today's transaction cannot proceed at this time." The room went completely silent. Ethan was still smiling. "What does that mean?" She opened the folder in her hands. "We have received a formal ownership dispute involving key music rights, as well as notice of an investigation concerning potentially unauthorized transfers, false chain of title representations, and related party payments." I watched the smile slowly disappear from Sienna's face. Then Ethan turned toward me. For the first time that day, he wasn't smiling either. I just sat there, because I had been waiting 6 weeks for that moment. But the real story had started 8 months earlier. My name is Sophie Lane. I was 34 years old, living in Nashville, Tennessee. I wasn't a singer. I wasn't a songwriter. I was a music royalty and rights auditor. Basically, my job was to help artists, songwriters, and independent labels answer one question: where did the money go? A song might only last 3 minutes, but the money it generates can come from dozens of different places: streaming, radio, television, advertising, movies, international licensing, live performance royalties, sync deals, digital platforms. If someone wants to quietly take part of that money, they usually don't write a note saying, "I'm stealing from you." They create another company, change the name on a contract, switch an administrator, make a suspicious payment look like a normal consulting fee. Then they take a little every month. Over time, a few $1,000s becomes hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions. My job was to follow the trail. I had been doing it for 10 years. I had helped musicians recover royalties from labels, publishers, managers, and distributors. So later, people kept asking me the same question. "You investigate financial problems for a living. How did you not realize your own husband was stealing from you?" The answer was simple. I investigated clients. I never thought I needed to investigate my husband. Ethan Vale and I had been married for 6 years. We had known each other for 9. He was 4 years older than me. When we first met, he wasn't the man he later became. No tailored suits, no private industry dinners, no investor meetings, no assistants following him through recording studios. He was a small-time producer with a rented studio. The building was old. The air conditioner broke every July. There were only 2 recording rooms, and the coffee machine leaked constantly. But Ethan understood music, really understood it. He could hear things most people missed: a drum hit that came in half a beat late, a harmony that was too crowded, whether a song needed another instrument or needed fewer instruments, whether a singer was technically perfect but emotionally empty. My father liked him the first time they met. My dad, Daniel Lane, was an old-school songwriter. He wasn't famous. At least most regular people wouldn't have recognized his name, but in the country music world, quite a few artists had recorded songs he wrote. When he was younger, he had written several successful songs, not enough to make him insanely rich, but enough that the publishing income had supported our family for years. When I was growing up, my dad used to say, "A valuable song can keep working long after the songwriter stops." I didn't really understand that as a kid. Once I started working in royalties and copyright, I understood exactly what he meant. If the rights are properly protected, a song can keep earning money for decades. My father died when I was 27. He left me the rights he still owned in 23 songs. 7 of them continued to generate steady income. 3 were especially valuable. They came from a group of songs he had written about 30 years earlier. To me, those songs were never just pieces of paper. They were part of my father's life. They were something he had spent years creating, and they were the one asset I never wanted to casually sell. Ethan knew that. Before we even got married, he told me, those songs should always stay yours. Even if we build a company together, don't put them inside the company. I remember thinking that was one of the reasons I trusted him. He respected boundaries, at least I thought he did. During the second year of our marriage, we started Veil House Music together. Ethan handled production and artist development. I helped build the early royalty systems, rights management structure, and financial processes. I never worked there full-time. My own audit practice was already doing well. Once Veil House became more stable, I moved further into the background. I owned 22% of the company as a founding shareholder. Ethan owned the majority. A few smaller investors owned the rest. The first few years were good. The company grew from 3 employees to 15. We signed 2 independent artists who started getting real attention. Then one of our songs exploded on short-form social media. Cash flow improved fast. So did Ethan's profile. There were interviews, industry dinners, travel, meetings, brand events. I was busy too. For a while, the most common sentence in our marriage became, "We'll talk about it this weekend." A lot of marriage problems probably begin with that sentence. We'll talk later. We'll talk when work calms down. We'll talk this weekend. Then one day, you finally have time, and nobody is talking anymore. Sienna Brooks joined the company 2 years before everything fell apart. She was 28, a singer, smart about social media, very good in front of a camera, and extremely good at making people notice her. The first time she auditioned at the studio, I was there. Afterward, she came over and shook my hand. "Sophie, I know who you are. I saw that interview you did about unpaid artist royalties." I liked her at first. She was sharp, fast, direct. Ethan signed her soon after. At the beginning, she was just another artist working with a producer. Then Ethan started mentioning her more. "Sienna understands the market. Sienna had a really good idea today. Sienna knows a brand we should talk to. Sienna thinks the company's visual identity is outdated." Once I joked, "You say her name more than you say mine." Ethan laughed and kissed my forehead. "Are you jealous?" "Not yet." And I meant it. I wasn't jealous. Not until the previous fall. I had been working on an audit for a client in Los Angeles. The project finished a day early. I didn't tell Ethan. I wanted to surprise him. When my flight landed, I went straight to the office. It was after 9 at night. Most of the staff had gone home. The light in Ethan's office was still on. The door wasn't fully closed. As I walked toward it, I heard someone laughing. Sienna. I stopped outside the office. They weren't kissing. They weren't doing anything I could immediately point to and call proof. But Sienna was sitting on Ethan's desk. Ethan was standing between her knees. They were so close that there really wasn't an innocent explanation that made sense. Then they saw me. Sienna immediately got off the desk. The first thing Ethan said was, "Why are you back today?" I still remember that sentence. Not, "This isn't what it looks like." Not even Sophie, just, "Why are you back today?" Like the real problem was that I had come home too early. I looked at him. Am I interrupting something? No. Sienna grabbed her bag. "I should go." I didn't stop her. When the door closed, Ethan started explaining. They had just been celebrating a new partnership. They had been drinking. She sat on the desk because there was nowhere else comfortable to sit. I asked him directly, "Are you two having an affair?" He answered immediately, "No." I looked at him for maybe 10 seconds. Then I nodded. Okay, that seemed to confuse him. "That's it?" "You said no. So for now, I'm going to accept that." I had no idea those words would later become one of the reasons he underestimated me. Ethan took my trust to mean I would never investigate. Over the next 3 months, our marriage got worse. He came home later. He changed the passcode on his phone. He started taking his phone into the bathroom when he showered. I wasn't blind. I saw all of it. But I didn't want to turn my marriage into another audit. I already spent 10 hours a day questioning other people's numbers. I didn't want to come home and start investigating my husband too, so I kept giving him room to explain. Until February. I accepted a major music rights audit for an independent label group in Canada. I needed to be in Vancouver for 16 days. The night before I left, Ethan helped me pack. He put my charger in my laptop bag. He reminded me to take my allergy medication. At the airport, I hugged him. "Are you going to miss me?" "Of course." 16 days later, I landed several hours earlier than expected. I dragged my suitcase home, and the code to our front door didn't work. I assumed I had typed it wrong. I tried again. Nothing. I called Ethan. No answer. A few minutes later, the garage door opened. Ethan walked out. Sienna was behind him. She was wearing my gray cashmere cardigan. I had bought it for myself on my birthday. I looked at her. Then at Ethan. This time I didn't need to ask anything. Ethan stood in the driveway. Sophie, we need to talk. Now? Now is probably best. Then he told me our marriage was over. He and Sienna had been together for 8 months. 8 months. I did the math instantly. That meant the night I found them in his office. They had already been having an affair for 2 months. That hadn't been the first time he lied to me, it had just been the first time I walked in on part of the truth. I looked toward the garage. Why is all my stuff in there? Ethan didn't answer right away. Sienna did. We organized it. Everything's packed. Inside the garage were 12 clear plastic storage bins, each one had a label: clothes, books, documents, kitchen miscellaneous. 6 years of marriage had been divided into 12 plastic boxes. I looked at Ethan. Where am I supposed to sleep tonight? He looked annoyed. Sophie, you have money. You can get a hotel. This is my home too. The house belongs to the company. I stared at him. What? When we refinanced 2 years ago, the ownership structure changed. It belongs to Vale House Holdings now. You signed it. For the first time, I genuinely had no idea what he was talking about. I never signed the house over to the company. Ethan looked at me. You signed a lot of documents. Then he added, you audit music rights for a living. Don't tell me you don't even remember what you signed. Sienna looked down and smiled. Barely. But I saw it. For 1 second, I wanted to push past both of them. I wanted to walk into my house. I wanted to pull my sweater off her body. I wanted to ask how many other things they had taken, but I didn't, because Ethan had just reminded me of something important. Documents. If the ownership of that house had been changed, there had to be documents. If I hadn't signed them, there had to be a record somewhere. So I only said, give me my boxes. Ethan looked surprised by how calm I was. You don't want to talk? Not tonight. He opened the garage all the way. I ordered a large rideshare. 12 boxes wouldn't fit. The first driver took 6. I ordered another car for the rest. Sienna stood near the doorway watching me. Before I left, she called my name. Sophie. I turned. She took off my gray cardigan and held it out. This is yours. I looked at it. No, you can keep it. Her expression changed. She looked almost embarrassed. I walked away. That night, I stayed at an ordinary business hotel near the airport. The room was small. My window looked directly into a parking structure. After I showered, I sat on the bed and opened our joint bank account, checking balance. $872. I stared at it. Then I opened savings. $11. I refreshed the screen. Still 11. 3 months earlier, there had been more than $194,000 in that account. Money we had been saving for travel, a future home, and long-term security. Now there were $11. I immediately tried to open our investment account. Login failed. The password had been changed. I called the bank. Customer service confirmed that most of the money had been moved out in 7 transfers over the previous 5 weeks. Every transfer had been initiated by Ethan. The largest one went to a vendor account connected to Vale House Music, a company I had never heard of, Silver North Creative LLC. I wrote the name down. I had barely ended the call when a new email appeared. From Ethan's attorney, subject, proposed marital settlement. I opened it. Ethan was offering me $10,000 in cash. I could keep my car, each of us would pay our own legal fees. In exchange, I would give up any claim to Vale House Music, give up any claim to the house, give up any future claim involving copyrights, distribution income, company growth, or related assets, and sign a permanent confidentiality agreement. Then I reached the final pages. One sentence caught my attention. Both parties acknowledge that Vale House Music is currently experiencing serious financial difficulties and that the equity may have little or no actual value. I stared at that sentence. The company had no value. 3 weeks earlier, I had seen a financing proposal from North Star Media sitting in Ethan's home office. I hadn't read the full amount, but I knew they were discussing something significant. If the company was really collapsing, why was someone negotiating a long-term distribution and financing deal? And if my 22% ownership was truly worthless, why was Ethan so desperate to make sure I gave it up? The next morning, I didn't call a divorce attorney first. I opened my laptop, and I searched Silver North Creative. It had been formed 14 months earlier. The registered agent was a standard corporate filing service. There was very little public information. The address belonged to a virtual office in downtown Nashville. Then I started reviewing payment records. Over the previous 10 months, Vale House Music had paid Silver North more than $4 million. The descriptions were vague. Brand consulting, digital promotion, artist development, international marketing. None of those expenses were impossible. The problem was the pattern. The numbers were too clean, and the spending had grown too quickly. I kept digging through state business records. Eventually, I found another company in the ownership chain. Brooks Rose Ventures. Brooks, Sienna Brooks. I leaned back in my hotel chair. For the first time, I felt genuinely cold. This wasn't just my husband spending marital money on his mistress. Sienna was inside the company's financial structure. Then another question hit me. What happened to my shares? A former client referred me to a divorce attorney named Michael Reed. He was in his 40s. He had spent years in commercial litigation before moving into high-asset divorces involving companies, intellectual property, and complex ownership structures. He read the proposed settlement, then asked one question. When was the last time you reviewed the company cap table? I haven't recently. Let's review it now. We searched the state records. My name still appeared in some public filings. But when Michael obtained a current internal shareholder schedule, my 22% was listed as 0. He looked at me. Did you sell your shares? No. Gift them? No. Sign a waiver? No, he turned the document toward me. Then somebody thinks you did. Attached was an electronic equity transfer agreement dated 15 months earlier. Signature. Sophie Lane Vale. It looked like my signature. I studied it twice. That isn't mine. Michael didn't tell me he believed me. He asked, "You're sure?" "Yes. How are you sure?" I pointed to the date. I was in Toronto that day. I was working on a royalty arbitration for a client. I was inside a law firm from 9 in the morning until 7 at night. Michael nodded. Good, I stared at him. What's good about this? You can prove where you were. That afternoon, I did something I had never done in 6 years of marriage. I started auditing my husband, not his texts, not his phone, his money, company payments, copyright administrators, distribution statements, related companies, trademark records, shareholder documents, electronic signature logs, one trail at a time. 3 days later, I found something that made me sit straight up. The royalty income from the 7 core songs my father had left me had fallen by almost 60% over the previous year. The songs hadn't stopped earning. Streaming activity had actually increased. The money had simply changed direction. A portion of the income that should have gone into Daniel Lane Estate Publishing was now being routed through a new publishing administration account. Silver North Rights Administration. Silver North again. I pulled the rights change documents. Then I stopped moving. According to the filings, 11 months earlier, I had granted Silver North 15 years of administration rights over 7 of my father's 23 songs. Not only administration rights, the company had sublicensing authority, international administration rights, certain financing rights, and the ability to use portions of future income in connection with commercial financing. The signature was mine again, except it wasn't. I had never signed it. Michael read the document. His first words were, "Do not call Ethan." I looked at him. "He's stealing my father's catalog. I understand. I want this frozen. We will now." Michael shook his head. "Sophie, first we need to understand why he needs these rights." I was furious. Why does he need them? For money. He wants money. How much? I didn't answer immediately, because I suddenly remembered North Star. That night, I sat in my hotel room and searched for almost 3 hours. At 1:40 in the morning, I found the answer. North Star Media was negotiating a major deal with Vale House. It wasn't a normal distribution agreement. It was a catalog-backed financing package combined with a global distribution agreement. Total value, $18 million. Among the assets Ethan had presented to North Star were Vale House's own catalogs, and something called the Daniel Lane Legacy Catalog. My father's songs. He had put my inheritance into his deal. Even worse, he represented to North Star that those rights had been fully and validly transferred to a Vale House affiliate. No unresolved ownership issues. I stared at those words. No unresolved ownership issues. Suddenly, everything made sense. Why he needed me out of the company. Why my ownership had disappeared. Why my father's songs had been reassigned. Why our joint accounts had been emptied. Why he wanted me to sign a settlement for $10,000. Ethan hadn't fallen in love with someone else and then decided to leave his wife. He had been planning this for more than a year. Sienna wasn't just the woman who came at the end. She was part of the structure, and my biggest mistake had been thinking my husband had only changed emotionally. He had been dismantling my life financially too. I called Michael. It was after 2 in the morning. He answered, "You're awake?" I found the deal. "How much?" $18 million. There was silence for 2 seconds, then he said, "Be in my office at 8. The next morning, Michael brought 2 other people into the conference room. One was a digital forensics specialist. The other was a music rights litigation consultant named Noah Grant. He was 37. He had previously worked at a large entertainment law firm handling digital evidence and chain of title disputes. Later, he started a smaller digital evidence practice. He wasn't very talkative. The first time we met, he didn't tell me my husband was terrible. He didn't ask for details about the affair. He opened the equity transfer document. "I need your old devices, as many as you still have." "Why?" "If this signature didn't come from you, we need to find out what device it came from." I gave him an old laptop, phone backups, cloud account records, and anything else he requested. 3 days later, he called. We found the first anomaly. The equity transfer agreement had been completed through an electronic signature platform. It used my email account. The verification code had been successfully entered. On the surface, it looked legitimate, but the device fingerprint did not match my laptop. It didn't match my phone either. The IP address came from Vale House's recording studio, more specifically from Ethan's office network. The signature was completed at 3:12 in the afternoon in Nashville. At exactly that time, I was sitting inside a law office in Toronto. There were building access records, flight records, hotel records, client emails, even a recorded video conference from the same afternoon. Noah said, "This does not prove who physically clicked the button, but it strongly supports that it did not come from your normal device." I asked, "What about the music rights assignment?" "Worse, what do you mean?" "Same browser environment, very similar device parameters. 4 months apart." I didn't say anything. Noah continued, "Someone had long-term access to your login information." Then I remembered something. When Vale House was still small, Ethan's outsourced IT team managed our company email accounts. My electronic signature account had been connected to that system too. I never separated everything later. We were married, we were building the company together. I had never seen a reason. That evening, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a long time. The part that hurt most wasn't even the money. It was realizing what Ethan had actually used, not my stupidity, my trust. He knew I didn't treat every permission inside a marriage as a security risk. He knew I wasn't checking my ownership percentage every month. He knew I almost never touched my father's catalog because I had no intention of selling it. He hadn't found a technical weakness. He had found the fact that I felt safe with him. 1 week later, Ethan requested our first formal divorce mediation. Michael and I went together. Ethan wore a basic navy suit. He wasn't wearing the expensive watch he usually wore. He had even arrived in an older company SUV. The second I saw him, I knew he was performing. Sienna came too. She sat outside the conference room. Her attorney described her as Ethan's business support. I almost laughed. During mediation, Ethan's lawyer explained that Vale House had serious cash flow problems. The company valuation had dropped. A debt restructuring might be necessary. Ethan supposedly had very few assets available to divide. They increased the settlement offer from $10,000 to $15,000. The conditions stayed the same. I gave up the company, I gave up future rights claims. I gave up claims involving related entities. Michael said nothing at first. He looked at me. We had already agreed on the plan. We were not exposing everything that day. I needed Ethan to believe I was scared, so I looked down. I stayed quiet. His lawyer asked, "Mrs. Vale, do you understand that continued litigation could potentially expose you to company debts as well?" I looked up. "I just want this to be over." I saw Ethan relax. Then he used that familiar voice. "Sophie, I'm not trying to ruin you. The company really is struggling." I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, "Could you give me $150,000? His lawyer answered immediately, "Absolutely not." I lowered my eyes. "Then $50,000, Ethan frowned. "Sophie, don't let lawyers make this more complicated than it needs to be. You've never cared that much about fighting over money." "Yes." He actually said that. "You've never cared that much about fighting over money." He had taken my willingness not to keep score in our marriage and decided it meant I never would. We didn't reach a settlement that day. Outside the mediation office, Ethan caught me near the elevators. "Sophie." I turned around. His voice softened. "You don't need to make the end of this ugly." "The end of what?" "Our marriage. At least leave something good behind." I looked at him. This man suddenly felt like a stranger. Then I said, "Okay." He visibly relaxed. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closed. Then I pulled out my phone and sent Michael one message. He believed it. We did not immediately file a public lawsuit revealing everything. Michael first sent North Star a formal notice disputing ownership of the relevant music rights. We gave them what was necessary. Nothing went to the media. We didn't contact Vale House artists. We didn't contact investors. North Star's own legal and transaction risk teams began a quiet review. At first, they were cautious. That was reasonable. In large business deals, an estranged spouse suddenly claiming ownership problems isn't unheard of. They weren't going to believe me simply because I said Ethan was lying, so we gave them evidence: electronic signature device logs, records proving I was in Toronto, original copyright registrations, my father's will, historical contracts, payment records, Silver North's corporate structure, and one more thing that became extremely important. A year before my father died, he digitized the entire publishing archive for all 23 songs. Every song had scanned paper agreements, old demo tape numbers, writing dates, revision notes, even copies of old mailing receipts showing when contracts had been sent to publishers. My dad had been obsessed with keeping records. When I was younger, I thought it was excessive. Now those files gave us an incredibly clean chain of title. North Star started taking the dispute seriously, but they didn't immediately terminate the transaction. Because Ethan kept supplying additional documents, and he kept making the same representations. All rights were validly transferred. There are no undisclosed disputes. Silver North is an independent service provider. He even signed a written representation stating there were no undisclosed related party interests involving Silver North. The problem was that Sienna held a significant economic interest in Silver North through another entity. If North Star kept investigating, they were going to find it. Ethan was getting desperate. He needed the $18 million. Vale House looked successful from the outside, but it had expanded too quickly. New studios, employees, artist advances, marketing expenses, office space. The company had reached a point where it needed more financing to continue operating at the same scale. If North Star didn't fund the deal, the company would start having cash problems within months. Ethan couldn't afford to stop. That was when I understood something about people who build complicated lies. Sometimes they don't keep lying because they think no one will ever find out. Sometimes they keep lying because they've reached a point where telling the truth feels even more dangerous. So they go forward. Sienna became more public too. She posted studio photos inside Ethan's car, jewelry that had once been in our house. Once, she even wore a leather jacket I had left behind. Those things weren't worth much money, but every time I saw them, it hurt. Eventually, I asked myself a simple question: Sophie, do you really need to keep looking? So I blocked her. Not because I was afraid of her, because knowing the truth did not mean I had to keep exposing myself to the same injury every day. A month later, I moved out of the hotel. I rented a small 2-bedroom apartment. One room became my office. The desk was cheap. The chair was uncomfortable. The kitchen had 4 coffee cups. That was about it. But the first night I closed the door behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Quiet. No Ethan. No company calls. No one coming home at midnight and telling me I probably won't be home tomorrow either. I started taking clients again. I worked during the day. At night, I worked on my own case. Noah often came over with new digital evidence. The first time he came to my apartment, he stopped at the door. Shoes off? I looked at him. I don't care. It's your place. You decide. He ended up taking them off. It was a tiny thing. But I noticed, maybe because for months everyone had been making decisions for me. My house, my company ownership, my father's songs, the end of my marriage. Suddenly someone was standing in my doorway asking, "What do you want?" It felt strange. There was no romance between Noah and me at first. Honestly, sometimes he annoyed me. His investigations were slow. One day I asked, "How much longer is this going to take?" He looked at me. "Do you want it fast or do you want something we can use in court?" "I want both." "That's not realistic." I glared at him. He kept drinking his coffee. "Then choose the second one." I was angry. Later, I realized he was right. He never gave me the answer I wanted just because I was upset, but he also never used his expertise to control me. Every report came with clear boundaries. This part is confirmed. This part is likely. This is only a theory. This does not have enough evidence yet. That kind of clarity slowly made me trust him. Then, about 2 weeks later, we found another problem. Michael received Vale House's formal financial disclosure. Ethan stated that Silver North was not related to him. Sienna was merely a signed artist. There were no undisclosed related party transactions. I read the document. How can he possibly write this? Michael shrugged slightly. Because he thinks you can't prove otherwise. Noah suddenly asked, "Has Sienna ever used another name professionally?" I thought about it. Her middle name is Rose. Why? He worked on his computer for several minutes. Then he turned the screen toward me. Brooks Rose Media Trust. Beneficiary, Sienna Rose Brooks. That trust held another layer of economic interest connected to Silver North. I stared at the screen. So she's not just being paid service fees. Noah shook his head. She has an economic interest in the profits. That was the first time I knew for certain that Sienna wasn't simply sleeping with my husband. She was financially participating in the structure. The next day, Michael asked whether I wanted to file for an emergency injunction. What happens if we do? North Star will probably pause the transaction immediately, and Ethan will know how much we have? Yes, what is North Star still waiting for? Final chain of title representations and a use of funds certification. Does Ethan have to sign? If he wants the $18 million? Yes. I nodded, then let him decide. Michael studied me. You're sure? I'm not forcing him to sign. I'm not lying to him. I have already raised a formal ownership dispute. He knows someone is challenging the rights. If he still wants to represent to the buyer that there is no dispute, that is his decision. Nobody argued. The next 6 weeks were the strangest part of the entire process. Ethan became more and more convinced I had given up. I didn't talk online. I didn't storm into Vale House. I didn't contact artists. I didn't publicly attack Sienna. During our second mediation, I even said, "I only want to keep the rights my father left me." Ethan answered immediately, "Those rights are already integrated into the corporate structure. They can't just be removed." "Why? Business arrangements?" "Which business arrangements?" He paused. Then he said, "That isn't something you need to worry about. 6 years earlier, that sentence would have started a fight. That day, I just nodded. Okay, I learned that sometimes arguing less makes an arrogant person talk more." Ethan started explaining that the company was about to complete a major strategic partnership, that the future structure would be complicated, that if I continued fighting over the catalog, everyone would lose money. Then he actually said, "Sophie, I'm trying to protect you." I almost laughed. I managed not to. Instead, I asked, "Then why did you take away my shares?" The room went silent. His attorney immediately jumped in. "That is a disputed fact." I kept looking at Ethan. I asked him. Ethan said, "You signed the transfer." "I don't remember doing that." "That's your problem." That sentence became useful later, too. 3 days before the North Star signing event, Vail House was invited to a major industry presentation in New York. There would be media streaming platforms, investors, artists, brand representatives. Ethan also planned to publicly announce Sienna as Vail House's new creative partner. At first, I had no intention of going. I didn't want to watch Ethan and Sienna stand on a stage celebrating a future they believed they had taken from me. That night, Noah came over to drop off his final report. I asked him, "If you were me, would you go?" He looked at me. "This isn't my case, I know." "Then why are you asking me?" "I want your opinion." He thought for a moment. "If you're going because you want to watch them get embarrassed, don't." I looked at him. "What if I'm going for myself?" "Then go. What's the difference? One keeps them at the center of the story. The other keeps you there." That night I decided to go. Sienna wore a silver dress. The moment I saw her, I noticed the guitar pick pendant around her neck. My father's pendant. After he died, I kept it in my jewelry box. When I was packing, I couldn't find it. Ethan told me. "It's probably in one of the boxes somewhere." Now I knew where it was. For a second, I expected to lose control. I didn't. Instead, I felt something become very clear. Ethan no longer belonged anywhere in my future. Before the event started, he saw me. He walked over and looked me up and down. "What are you doing here?" "I was invited." He frowned. "Sophie, today is not the place to deal with personal issues." "I agree. Then don't make a scene." "I'm not planning to." He clearly didn't believe me. Then he lowered his voice. "After today, a lot of things are going to be final. You need to accept reality." "What reality?" "The company moves forward. I move forward. You should too." I nodded. "I am." He didn't understand what I meant. A few minutes later, the presentation started. Ethan went on stage. He talked about company growth, artists, global distribution. Then he introduced Sienna, my partner both creatively and personally. There was some applause, some laughter. I sat near the back. Then the screen behind them lit up. $18 million. Ethan talked about the future, trust, partnership, long-term vision. At one point he said, "The music industry is ultimately built on relationships." That almost made me laugh. He was right. Relationships mattered. They just shouldn't be built on someone else's forged signature. Eventually, the signing portion began. Ethan voluntarily addressed what he called outside rumors. He said all documents were valid. I had already exited the company. I had no additional interest in the transaction. Then he looked at me and smiled. That was the moment from the beginning of the story. North Star's general counsel walked onto the stage. She announced the deal was paused, not canceled, paused, because of rights ownership issues and related party financial concerns. At first, Ethan tried to keep his expression calm. "This sounds like a routine procedural matter," she answered, "not entirely." Then she said the name Silver North. Sienna's face went white. Ethan looked at her. That one look told me something I hadn't known before. The two of them hadn't even told each other everything. The event ended early. Reporters started gathering outside. Ethan came backstage looking for me. For the first time, he completely lost his composure. "What did you do?" I looked at him. "I filed an ownership dispute. You destroyed an $18 million deal. I didn't make you submit false documents." "They're not false." "Then let them investigate." He stepped closer. "Has Noah been helping you this entire time?" It was the first time he had said Noah's name. I paused. "You've been investigating me?" Ethan realized too late what he had revealed. The company needed to know who you were contacting. "So after separating from me, you were still monitoring me?" "It wasn't monitoring. What was it?" He had no answer. That created another problem for him. Later, we learned Vale House's IT contractor still had recovery access to one of my old company email accounts. Ethan had asked the contractor to check whether I had been sending information to competing companies. Our attorneys added that to the evidence. North Star didn't immediately terminate the deal, but they demanded a complete chain of title review. At the same time, I formally asked the court to restore my ownership interest and freeze the disputed catalog transfers. Ethan still refused to admit anything. In sworn testimony, he claimed, "I signed the equity transfer voluntarily. I approved the transfer of my father's catalog." Sienna had no undisclosed relationship with Silver North. Every transaction was a normal business transaction. That was when Noah finally said, "We have enough." We submitted the device logs, login records, cloud verification history, proof that I was in Toronto, and one thing Ethan had never thought about: the studio's security system. The building used smart access control. Every office entry was logged. On the day my equity transfer was supposedly signed, Ethan entered his office at 2:47 in the afternoon. My electronic signature was completed at 3:12. Ethan left at 3:26. No other senior employee entered during that period. It could not prove with absolute certainty that Ethan physically clicked the mouse, but when combined with everything else, the picture was clear. More importantly, North Star's internal investigators uncovered Silver North's real ownership chain. Sienna held a financial interest. Vale House had paid Silver North more than $4 million over the previous year. A significant amount of that money eventually reached accounts connected to Sienna, and Ethan had formally represented that there were no related party transactions. His signature was right there. That was when he finally stopped making public statements. 3 weeks later, North Star officially terminated the deal. Vale House's cash flow problems started almost immediately. 2 artists demanded contract renegotiations. An investor pulled out. A brand suspended its campaign. I didn't call any of them. I didn't have to. The structure started falling under its own weight. The person who surprised me most was Sienna. She called me. I didn't answer. Then she texted, "We need to talk." I didn't respond. On the 3rd day, she came directly to Michael's office, with her own attorney. She wanted to cooperate, according to Sienna. She had believed Ethan was only restructuring marital and business assets. She knew we were getting divorced. She knew Silver North was receiving money. She knew she had an economic interest in it. But she claimed she didn't know my signatures had been forged. She claimed she didn't know my father's catalog had never been properly transferred. I had no idea how much of that was true, and I didn't need to decide. She began turning over emails, texts, contracts. One text from Ethan stopped me. He had sent it shortly before my Vancouver trip. "Once Sophie leaves town, we'll finish the last cleanup." Sienna had answered, "What if she notices?" Ethan wrote back, "She never audits her own people." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Michael asked, "Do you need a break?" I shook my head. No. But when I got home that night, I cried harder than I had since the day Ethan threw me out. Not because of the affair. Not even because of the money. Because of that sentence. She never audits her own people. He knew I trusted him, and he used that trust as a tool. After I finally stopped crying, I texted Noah, "You awake?" 2 minutes later, "Yes. Can you come over?" He didn't ask what happened. 40 minutes later, he showed up with 2 coffees. I looked at them. It's 11 at night. "You never told me coffee was illegal after 11. I sat at the kitchen counter and showed him Ethan's message. Noah read it. He didn't say, "He never deserved you." He didn't tell me not to cry. He just asked, "Do you want to be alone, or do you want somebody to sit here?" I thought about it. "Sit here." Okay. We sat there for almost an hour. We barely talked. That was the first time I admitted to myself that I might be starting to like him. But I also knew I wasn't ready to jump into another relationship. So the next day, I told him directly, "I have feelings for you." He almost put his coffee down in the wrong place. "That direct? I don't want to guess anymore." He smiled a little. "Okay, but I don't want a relationship right now." "Okay. That doesn't bother you?" "No." "Why?" "You're getting divorced. Your case isn't finished. Your entire life was just turned upside down. Not wanting to immediately start something new sounds pretty reasonable." I looked at him. "What about you? I can like you. You don't have to do anything about it yet." That was something Ethan had never really given me. Space without pressure. No debt. No, if you love me, you should. No rush, just room. The case didn't end overnight like it would in a movie. Real life takes longer. The company dispute, copyright litigation, divorce assets, possible criminal issues. All of it took close to a year to work through. Eventually, Ethan admitted that some of the documents had not been signed personally by me. The false business representations and related financial transfers entered formal legal proceedings. I stopped needing to know what his life looked like every day. I didn't need to watch him lose everything. Vale House was eventually restructured. Much of its core catalog was sold to a third party to cover debts and legal costs. My 22% founding interest was restored for purposes of the settlement, and I received compensation for it all. 23 of my father's songs returned fully to my control. Silver North's long-term administration agreement was canceled. Some of the royalties that had been redirected were repaid over time. We did not recover every dollar Ethan had transferred from our joint accounts, but most of it came back. The house was sold. I received the portion I was legally entitled to. Sienna lost her position with Vale House. Eventually, she tried to restart her career as an independent artist. She sent me one email. It was only a few paragraphs. She wrote, "I used to think you already had everything, the company, the marriage, respect in the industry, so I convinced myself that taking something from you wasn't as serious. I told myself you could afford to lose a little." I stopped reading for a moment. I knew that logic. Strong people can lose more. Successful people can absorb more damage. If you're capable of surviving something, then hurting you somehow looks less serious. I eventually replied with one sentence. My ability to survive did not give either of you the right to make me carry more. We never spoke again. Ethan's last email came after the major disputes were resolved. He wrote, "I spent years believing that as long as the company became successful, I could explain everything else later. Now I understand I wasn't protecting the company. I was protecting a lie that kept getting bigger." His final sentence said, "I know being sorry doesn't give me the right to ask for you back." I didn't respond because he was right about one thing. An apology is not a transaction. You cannot trade "I'm sorry" for a person. And regret does not create a right to be trusted again. A year and a half later, I started my own company. Clearline writes, "We didn't manage artists. We didn't sign musicians. We focused on royalty audits, digital evidence, copyright ownership, and recovery of unpaid money." Especially for independent creators who didn't have giant legal teams protecting them. A lot of people came into my office and started with the same sentence. "I'm probably overthinking this. He's my manager. He wouldn't steal from me. That's my husband. He wouldn't do something like that. We've worked together for 10 years. I never answered, "Yes, you're definitely being cheated." I just said, "Okay, let's look at the records. Documents don't love you. They don't hate you either. They simply record what happened." 2 years later, Clearline had 12 employees. I licensed one of my father's oldest songs for an independent film. When the first royalty statement came in, I sat in my office and stared at his name, Daniel Lane. I missed him. When I was a child, he used to say, "Putting your name on your work isn't about making sure everyone sees you. It tells people who is responsible for it." Back then, I thought he sounded old-fashioned. Now I understood. A name isn't just ego, it's a boundary. It marks ownership, and it carries responsibility. Noah and I didn't go on our first real date until 6 months after my case was mostly finished. We went to a normal Mexican restaurant. No expensive wine, no music industry people. Halfway through dinner, he asked, "So do you still think you're not ready to date?" I thought about it. "I'm maybe 60% ready. Is 60 passing?" "Barely." He laughed. Our relationship never turned into some huge dramatic romance overnight. It was slow. At first we saw each other once a week, then twice. He never acted like I owed him something because he had helped me. The first time Clearline needed digital forensic work, I asked him for a quote. He sent his normal rate. I looked at him. "No girlfriend discount? Do you need a discount?" I thought about it. "No." "Then why would I make your company's books less clean just because you're dating me?" I stared at him. "You're really not romantic." "I can buy flowers separately," and he did. The work still got properly invoiced. I loved that because I was finally learning not to mix everything together. Love, money, help. Responsibility, they didn't have to become one thing. 3 years later, Noah proposed, not at a music festival, not in a studio. He didn't even play one of my father's songs. He told me later, "Those songs belong to you and your father." I didn't want to use them to manufacture a moment that was supposed to be ours. We were organizing a bookshelf at home. He pulled a ring box from behind a book on copyright law. I stared at him. "Why did you hide it there?" "Because you were never going to voluntarily open that book." I started laughing. Then he looked at me. "Sophie, do you want to build a life with me? Not, let me protect you. Not, you need me. Just, do you want to build a life with me?" I said yes. People have asked me whether Ethan and I would still be married if he had never cheated. I don't know. If he had simply stopped loving me, maybe we could have ended things peacefully. Sienna wasn't the only thing that destroyed our marriage. The deeper problem was what Ethan believed marriage allowed him to do. Because I was his wife, my access could be used. My signature could be used. My money could be moved. My father's songs could be put into a business deal first and explained to me later. He treated intimacy like unlimited authorization, and I had made my own mistake too. I used to think trusting someone meant not checking, not asking too many questions, not looking too closely. I don't believe that anymore. Healthy trust can survive questions. A trustworthy person doesn't accuse you of not loving them because you want to read a contract. They don't call you selfish because you ask where the money went. They don't tell you that keeping your own account, career, ownership, or rights means you don't believe in the marriage. Loving someone does not mean handing them ownership of your judgment. Marriage is not an unlimited power of attorney. I can love you and still keep my name, my work, my money, my decisions, my boundaries. Those things are not backup plans. They are part of who I am. Yes, I recovered money from Ethan, shares, royalties, my father's catalog, but the most important thing I got back wasn't financial. It was my confidence in my own judgment. When someone lies to you for a long time, the most dangerous thing isn't that you stop trusting other people. It's that you start distrusting yourself. You start asking, am I being too sensitive? Did I remember it wrong? Should I be more understanding? Maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe I really don't understand what's happening. It took me a long time to get those questions out of my head. Now when something feels wrong, I look at it, I ask questions, I check. Not because I became paranoid, because I finally learned that taking my own instincts seriously does not make me difficult. And someone who truly loves me will never require me to close my eyes as proof that I trust him. For a while, I thought Ethan had taken my company, my money, my father's music. Eventually, I understood what he had come closest to taking, my belief in myself. Thankfully, he didn't. He could alter a document, he could change a cap table, he could move money into another account. But he couldn't decide who I was, and he couldn't decide whether I would start over. So now, when a woman sits across from me in my office and says, I feel like something is wrong but I don't have proof, I don't laugh. I don't say, you're probably imagining it. I open the computer and I tell her, okay, let's look. Because sometimes what a person needs is not someone who immediately says, you are absolutely right. Sometimes she just needs someone willing to search for the truth with her. That became one of the biggest lessons I learned about love too. Healthy love is not blind loyalty. It isn't. I'll believe anything you say because I love you. It's, I'll listen. I'll take what you're telling me seriously. If I don't understand, we can look together. If you're wrong, I won't humiliate you. And if you're right, I won't pretend I didn't see the truth just because it makes my life uncomfortable. Noah doesn't agree with me all the time. Sometimes he thinks my contracts are too conservative. Sometimes he tells me I'm working too much. Sometimes I think a client is hiding something and he thinks the evidence isn't strong enough yet. We argue, but he never uses love to shut me up. He never says, I made the decision for you because I love you. That is what safety means to me now, not someone promising they will never make a mistake, but knowing that even when mistakes happen, you remain a complete person. You can say no. You can ask why. You can ask for an explanation. You can leave, and protecting yourself does not automatically cost you all the love in the room. Ethan once stood in front of 200 people and told everyone I had walked away, that I had no claim left, that I had nothing. He was wrong. But not just because the $18 million never arrived. Not because Vale House later collapsed. He was wrong because he believed a document someone had altered could decide who I was. Now I don't need a contract to tell me what belongs to me. My career belongs to me. My father's songs belong to me. My judgment belongs to me. My voice belongs to me. My boundaries belong to me. And the right to decide who gets to stand beside me belongs to me too. Someone who truly loves me will never take those things away and call it marriage. He'll stand beside me, watch me put my own name on my own work, and say without hesitation, yes, that's yours. And now I finally understand something I wish I had understood years ago. The right kind of love never asks you to lose yourself first just to prove how much you love someone else.